If you walk into a pawn shop in Gallup, New Mexico, or a high-end gallery in Santa Fe, you're going to see it, that unmistakable flash of silver and the deep electric blue of turquoise. For a lot of people, Native American jewelry is just a souvenir. It's something you buy on a road trip through Arizona to put on a shelf. But if you actually look at these pieces, really look at them, you aren't just looking at decoration, you're looking at resistance. You're looking at a survival manual written in metal. The history of Native American silversmithing isn't ancient history. It didn't happen 1,000 years ago. It started in the fires of the mid-19th century, born out of necessity, war, and a clash of cultures that should have destroyed these tribes, but instead gave them a new voice. Today we're doing a deep dive. We're going to talk about how the Navajo learned to turn enemy currency into art, how the Zuni mastered the mosaic, and how the Hopi created a style so distinct it requires a double layer of silver to execute. We're talking about the sky stone, the tourist traps that almost killed the industry, and the masters like Charles Loloma who took this craft and shoved it into the world of modern art. I'm Cody, this is Mystic Apothecary. Let's talk about the silver soul of the Southwest. To understand the jewelry, you have to understand the environment. The Navajo, or Diné, were originally nomadic. They didn't carry heavy anvils or elaborate workshops. Before the 1850s, the Diné weren't working silver. They were warriors and weavers, but they were also incredible adapters. The story begins with a man named Atsidi Sani. His name translates to Old Smith. In the early 1850s, Atsidi Sani was actually a blacksmith. He worked with iron. He learned his trade from a Mexican silversmith named Nakai Tsosi, or a thin Spaniard who wandered into Navajo territory. At first, Sani was making bridles and bits for horses, practical stuff. Iron was tough, ugly, and useful. But around 1865, things changed. The Navajo were rounded up by the US government and forced onto the long walk to Bosque Redondo. It was a concentration camp. It was during this time of absolute darkness that the transition happened. The Navajo observed the silver ornaments worn by the Spanish soldiers and the Mexican vaqueros. They saw the concha or shell designs on the bridles. They saw the flash of metal against the desert sun. When they were finally allowed to return to their homeland in 1868, Atsidi Sani began teaching his sons and others how to work silver. But they didn't have mines. They didn't have supply chains. So where did the silver come from? It came from the pockets of the occupiers. They melted down American coins, silver dollars, half dollars, quarters. They melted down Mexican pesos. They took the currency of the people who tried to erase them and hammered it into symbols of their own beauty. That is the core of this art form. It's alchemy. By 1880, a student of Sani's named Atsidi Chan did something revolutionary. He took a piece of turquoise and set it into the silver. Before this, the stones were just glued or held with clay. Chan built a bezel. He married the metal to the stone. And just like that, the Navajo style, heavy silver, simple bezels, massive stones, was born. Let's pause on the materials for a second, because a jeweler is nothing without their ingredients. The big one obviously is turquoise. To the tribes of the Southwest, turquoise isn't just a rock, it is the sky stone. It represents water, sky, and health. It's literally a piece of the heavens that fell to earth. And in the high desert, where water is life, a stone the color of water is the most precious thing you can hold. But you'll also see a lot of red, that's coral, and you'll see this vibrant orange and purple shell called spiny oyster. Here's a cool fact. Spiny oyster isn't an oyster, it's a mollusk related to the scallop, and it definitely doesn't live in Arizona. It comes from the Sea of Cortez and the Baja Coast. So how did it get to the middle of the high desert? Trade routes. Ancient trade routes that go back 1,000 years. The ancestral Puebloans were trading turquoise for these shells long before the Spanish arrived. When you see a necklace with turquoise and spiny oyster, you are seeing a map of commerce that connected the mountains to the ocean. And then there's jet, which is fossilized coal used for black, and heishi, which are these impossibly tiny beads made by grinding down shell and stone against rock until they are smooth, uniform discs. The word heishi literally means shell in the Kiowa Pueblo language. The materials are simple, the genius is in what they do with them. So the Navajo started it, but they didn't keep it to themselves. In 1872, Atsidi Chan, the guy who first set the turquoise, traveled to the Zuni Pueblo. He taught a Zuni man named Lanyade the basics of silversmithing. But the Zuni were different. They weren't nomads. They lived in settled villages or pueblos. They had been lapidary artists, stone carvers, for centuries. So when the Zuni got hold of silver, they treated it differently. To a Navajo, the silver is the main event, and the stone is the accent. To a Zuni, the silver is just a frame for the stone. This is why Zuni jewelry is famous for inlay and needlepoint. They cut stones into tiny, precise shapes and fit them together like a mosaic. If you see a piece that looks like a painting made of stone, or a petit point cluster that looks like a snowflake made of tiny turquoise teardrops, that is Zuni. It's an incredibly patient art. Some Zuni needlepoint pieces contain hundreds of tiny stones, each one hand-ground to fit a specific bezel. Then the knowledge moved again. Lanyard went to the Hopi mesas in 1898 and taught a man named Sikyatala. For a long time, Hopi jewelry looked just like Navajo or Zuni jewelry. They were all using the same techniques, but in the 1930s and 40s, the Hopi decided they needed their own visual identity. This brings us to Fred Cody. Fred Cody was a famous Hopi artist and painter. Along with a silversmith named Paul Sofke, they developed a technique that is now the hallmark of the Hopi, overlay. Overlay is brilliant in its simplicity and its difficulty. You take 2 sheets of silver. On the top sheet, you cut out a design, usually a clan symbol, a rain cloud, or a migration pattern, using a tiny saw. You are creating negative space. Then, you solder that top sheet onto the bottom sheet. You texture the bottom sheet and oxidize it so it turns black. Then you polish the top sheet so it shines. The result is a design that pops in 3D silver and black. It is clean, modern, and distinctively Hopi. It owes nothing to the Zuni or the Navajo. It is a style that says, we're still here, and we know exactly who we are. We have to address the most famous piece of jewelry in the Southwest, the squash blossom necklace. You've seen it, the big silver beads that look like flowers and the crescent moon pendant at the bottom. There's a lot of bad information out there about this. First, the squash blossom beads aren't squash blossoms. They were likely inspired by the pomegranate flowers that Spanish soldiers wore on their silver trouser ornaments. The Navajo saw these pomegranates and thought they looked like the squash flowers they grew in their fields, so the name stuck. It was a visual translation. Second, the crescent pendant at the bottom is called the Naja. The symbol isn't originally Native American either, it's Moorish. It came from the Middle East, traveled to Spain, then to Mexico, and then to the Navajo. The Spanish used it on horse bridles to ward off the evil eye. The Navajo adopted it because it looked beautiful and powerful. It's a perfect example of how cultures blend. A Moorish symbol, a Spanish pomegranate, made by a Navajo smith using American coins. It's a global story hanging around your neck. But then came the tourists, and with them the Fred Harvey era. In the early 1900s, the Santa Fe Railroad brought thousands of tourists to the Southwest. They wanted souvenirs. But traditional native jewelry was heavy, expensive, and huge. The chief blanket style, the heavy concho belts, they were too much for an East Coast tourist to wear back in Boston. So, the Fred Harvey Company, which ran the hotels and restaurants along the rail line, started commissioning lighter, cheaper jewelry. They literally gave the smiths sheets of commercial silver and pre-cut turquoise. They also handed them stamps with symbols that they thought white tourists would like. Thunderbirds, crossed arrows, rattlesnakes. Here's the kicker. A lot of those symbols didn't mean anything traditional. The Thunderbird was barely used in Navajo iconography until the traders pushed it because it looked Indian to the tourists. This era flooded the market with Fred Harvey-style jewelry. It was mass-produced, sometimes even by machines in factories, but sold as authentic. It almost killed the high-end art form because it drove prices down and cheapened the aesthetic. But ironically, today, those vintage Fred Harvey pieces are highly collectible because they represent a specific moment in American history, the moment the West was sold to the East. We can't finish this without talking about the guys who took this craft and turned it into high art. If you know one name in modern native jewelry, it has to be Charles Loloma. Loloma was Hopi, born in 1921. He started as a potter and a muralist. But when he started making jewelry in the 1950s, he broke every rule in the book. Traditionalists said, Hopi jewelry is silver overlay, period. Loloma said, watch this. He started using gold. He started using diamonds, sugilite, lapis lazuli, and exotic woods. He did height inlay, where the stones stick up out of the bezel like a skyscraper city. He famously said he wanted to create jewelry that had a soul. He would inlay stones on the inside of a bracelet against the skin where only the wearer would know they were there. He called it inner beauty. He was controversial. He was rejected from Indian market shows early on because his work wasn't Indian enough. But he forced the world to accept that native artists didn't have to stay in a museum box. They could be modernists. They could be avant-garde. Then you have Kenneth Begay, the father of modern Navajo jewelry. While Loloma was going wild with color, Begay was going sleek. He worked at the White Hogan shop in Scottsdale. He took the old, clunky Navajo designs and streamlined them. Clean lines, elegant curves, modernism. If you see a piece of Navajo silver that looks like it could have been designed by a Danish mid-century architect, it's probably influenced by Kenneth Begay. And we have to mention tufa casting. This is one of the oldest and coolest techniques. The artist takes a block of tufa stone, a porous volcanic rock found on the reservation, and carves a negative mold directly into the stone. They pour molten silver into it. The heat destroys the mold, meaning usually you can only get one good cast. It's a one-of-a-kind piece. The texture of the tufa stone transfers to the silver, giving it this rough sandstone-like skin. It's raw and beautiful. So the next time you see a turquoise cuff or a silver squash blossom, don't just think Southwest style. Think about Atsidi Sani learning to hammer iron in a time of war. Think about the Zuni lapidaries grinding stones down to the millimeter. Think about Fred Cody inventing a new language in silver to save his culture's identity. This jewelry is more than just accessories. It is an archive of resilience. It is the earth, the sky, and the history of a people who refuse to fade away. I'm Cody, and this is Mystic Apothecary. Hit like and subscribe for more videos like this.